Excellent. So we are now on YouTube. I will copy the link for your reference, and then I will let people in. And Nicholas, from here on, if more people join the waiting room, please feel free to let them in.
Yeah, I will do so.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone. It's exactly 10 o'clock now. It's great to see that we have already 30 participants with us and raring to go. I might wait just one quick moment because I see we have more people entering the waiting room every few seconds, and then we can get ourselves started. So for your information, my name is Adrienne and I work at ECLAE Europe. ECLAE is a network of local governments for sustainability. And one of my roles there is to work on the SONNET project, which is why we're all together here. The SONNET project is focused on the social side of energy transition to sort of summarize it. So in other words, we're looking at new ways of doing things, organizing, thinking that help us to achieve energy systems change. And today that focuses on campaigning and activism. So how we can bring forth campaigns and movements against fossil fuel energy pathways. So I think I will launch right into it. So to let you know a bit about the structure of today's webinar, it's really not so much a webinar. I think calling it that is a bit misleading. I only have slides to introduce our 4 speakers because I've found that it sometimes helps people to kind of absorb introductions if they can read at the same time. And once our 4 speakers are introduced, there'll be no more slide decks or presentations. It's really just a conversation among activists about taking stock of what's happened this past year as the year comes to an end, trying to tie in COP26 a little bit, since that's obviously on everyone's minds, and then closing by looking forward to the next steps. About halfway through the webinar, we will invite participants to turn on their cameras and microphones and ask questions as well and engage in the discussion. Until then, if possible, it would be great if people could please keep their cameras and microphones off, but you can always feel free to use the chat. My colleague Nicholas is also a host. He also has the ability to connect you and help you out, and he will be monitoring the chat. Another thing for you to note is that we are recording this meeting and live streaming it to YouTube. So if you would prefer not to have your face or your name shared publicly, please be sure to stick to the chat function since the chat will not be shared. And with that, I think I will share my screen and launch right into our speaker introductions. This is only a 1-hour webinar. We don't have too much time, so I think we should just get going. I will ask our speakers when I introduce you to just give a wave so people know who I'm referring to. So first up, we have Barbara Richardson. Barbara has just given you a little wave. Barbara actually started out working as an IT professional, but after years of working in IT and not actually being all that active in these movements and in activism, she became engaged in opposing fracking in her small rural village when it was directly threatened by a company that wanted to frack for shale gas. Since then, she founded the Rosaker Awareness Group, which has subsequently joined forces with other groups to form Frack Free Lancashire. And she's also worked with many other organizations like Greenpeace and Frack Free United and Friends of the Earth, with whom she's also been involved in the COP21 in Paris, which of course led to the Paris Agreement. Next up, we have Hiska Arts. Hiska.
Sorry, Adrienne, you just got unmuted by accident.
There we go. Hopefully you were able to hear me up until then. Hiska is also with us today, and she is a campaigner at Fossil Free Netherlands. Before becoming a climate activist, she was the founder of an NGO which designed interactive exhibitions, films, and games on social processes. But after leading that organization, she wanted to move from awareness to concrete action. And that's why she shifted towards campaigning for the climate crisis. And since summer 2020, she has been working specifically on the Fossil Free Netherlands campaign to try to push ABP, which is the Dutch National Pension Fund, to divest from fossil fuel producers. And excitingly, just a couple months ago, ABP did announce that they will be divesting from fossil fuel producers. So that was, I think, quite an impressive win. Next, we have Lorraine with us. Lorraine is a community campaigner who has been fighting unconventional oil and gas extraction since 2013. She's the co-founder of the Wheeled Action Group, which is an umbrella organization for local campaigning against oil and gas extraction across all the southeastern UK. And she also campaigns with several other groups like Frack Off London, Frack Free Sussex, Frack Free Surrey, it's a real tongue twister, and the international group Shale Must Fall. And last but certainly not least with us is Dominica Lasota. Dominica is a climate justice activist and she's a coordinator with Fridays for Future. She's been active in campaigning for just transition, both in her home country of Poland, as well as at the EU and the global levels. Alongside 3 other Fridays for Future leaders, namely Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, and Mitzi Tan, she recently launched an emergency appeal for climate action ahead of COP26, which calls on world leaders to do a few things, including halting fossil fuel investment, subsidies, and new projects, demanding that countries deliver the over 80 billion euros that they have promised to the nations most vulnerable to climate disaster, and to enact climate policies that protect workers and the most vulnerable. So thank you very much all for being here. I'm actually already going to stop sharing my screen since those are my only slides and launch right into the discussion. So for this part of the discussion, I'll ask just our 4 speakers to keep their cameras on, and then about halfway through, we'll open it back up. So to begin with, I'd like to ask each of you to go around and just take 1 or 2 minutes to start with the question of the hour, which is reflecting on the past year. And I'm wondering if you could each just in 1 or 2 minutes, tell me a bit about what progress you've made in your own work in this year, or what progress you've seen in your community in 2021. And Hiska, since I already mentioned one of your big wins, I might ask that you start us off.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So we had some major win after campaigning for 7 years on ABP, which is the biggest European pension fund and the 5th biggest in the world. To divest, and finally after 7 years of campaigning they made a decision to divest together with 2 other pension funds in the Netherlands, and we were also campaigning for those, and this has been quite amazing and also a shock to us. I mean, we didn't expect it to go this fast. We were campaigning for it and hoping for it, but we do feel there is a shift in narrative, and certainly the divestment narrative was always kind of like extreme or like really activist, and suddenly it has turned mainstream. And I think this has been the main change as well. So, yeah.
Excellent. And Dominica, I mentioned in the introduction, the divestment comes into play with the petition that you put forth. Maybe you could talk a little bit also about progress, including that petition, but also more widely in the past year.
Yes, of course. Well, the petition has been part of what the Fridays for Future has been doing around COP26 this year. We were aware that the COP has been postponed since last year, and it has been, such a source of hopelessness, I think, and outrage for many of our activists. So we really, we felt that this moment is very important, that after the 2 years of the pandemic, the politicians and people across the world will focus on Glasgow and on COP26. And so we hoped and we wanted to make sure we can do, as best as possible to make the most out of this political moment and pressure those in power as best as possible. So besides the amount of the crazy amount of work that has been put in, kind of supporting the voices of the people from the global south, from our activists there has been this idea coined to launch such an emergency appeal As this, we launched this out on, remember, on Saturday or Sunday before COP. And within hours, there have been like 100,000 signatures under this, and it kept going. And by the end of COP, there was almost 2 million signatures. But especially just at the beginning when it was launched, and we saw how much people kind of picked it up. It amazed me so much, because it really showed that there is this incredible need for leadership, and that there is this scarcity of leadership, of real climate leadership at the moment. And people just want to see it. And especially in like moments like these, like COP26, people really, really needed to see someone stepping up and treating the crisis seriously. Well, a lot of leaders, especially from like most vulnerable nations, have shown true leadership, and they've been fighting like hell at this conference. But then you would see leaders like Boris Johnson, Frans Timmermans, and Joe Biden, running away from their responsibility, or even blocking some of the negotiations. And that was disheartening. And I think it showed us that there's just so much work to be done going into 2022.
Yeah, and I think mentioning Boris Johnson seems like an excellent segue to our two UK speakers, who I saw kind of grin and maybe roll eyes a little bit at mentioning all these national leaders and how they're stepping away from their responsibilities on the climate emergency. So yeah, Barbara, I see you nodding away. Perhaps I'll pass over to you. You can respond to that, but also feel free to also reflect on progress that's been made in your community the last year. Barbara, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry about that, it wouldn't unmute. Sorry, yeah, the international situation really concerns me, more so than the local. There's been amazing progress in the last 18 months, and I think there's been a real shift with public opinion and people wanting to be seen to be acting on climate change. However, I remain really cynical, and I'm really concerned that people are keen to be seen to be doing things, but I'm not convinced that they're going to act on them. And as an example, this morning, I've just seen some of us announce that Lloyd's, the insurers, are looking to renege on their original promises for moving away from insuring damage in fossil fuel industries. So, it's more about, I think this is what the focus over the next year needs to be. It's to be hitting the industry to make it financially unpalatable, to make it, not to be seen as a good thing to be investing in. So hit them where it hurts in the pockets. So yeah, I liken it to the Titanic. We've seen the iceberg. Everybody can see it's coming. We know there's a huge problem ahead of us. And we're starting to veer away from that iceberg. We're starting to move away from the danger. However, there's not enough people working to shift it quickly enough to get away from that danger. And if we don't address that as activists or campaigners or whatever, I think we're still in a real danger. And, in the UK, there's very much a greenwash going on, very much about blue hydrogen and things like that. Things we need to be aware of. Fracking, there's a moratorium, as most people probably understand, there's a moratorium on fracking, but that does not include other fossil fuel extraction methods. And hydrogen is still high, in the background. I can see the industry is looking to use that as a lever to get back into the marketplace. So I'm amazed at the progress that's been made. It's fantastic, and from grassroots and from the campaign groups, from the NGOs and everything, fabulous news, but a lot of work still to do, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Lorraine, ask you to close us out in this first round on reflecting on the last year, and also, of course, feel free to respond to any other comments that you've heard so far.
Yep. I kind of echo Barbara and what other speakers have said. That the tide has slowly turned, and for years, we have been raising awareness and emphasizing like the negative impacts. So I got muted. So yeah, the negative impacts of the local environment, impact of heavy goods vehicles, risk of pollution to air, water and soil, and climate change, and the risk of seismicity, which is what brought about the moratorium on fracking, and detrimental effect on wildlife. You know, we built alliances with other groups so that objections to all of these oil and gas applications weren't just local, it was a national level. It affected us on a national level. And finally, you know, the people that are responsible for making those decisions at a local level, they're listening. The councils are slowly repeating what we have been telling them for years. And many applications for oil and gas are being refused at the onset. And that is despite the planning officer being recommended approval. You know, our government, like we have what's called an NPPF, it's a National Planning Policy Framework, and the government instructs our councils to look at any hydrocarbon applications in a favourable light and to approve them. And so our councillors have been going against that. And we have had had 3 wins in the south east of Dunsfold, a little island of Isle of Wight, Balcombe, which is kind of the flagship of the anti-fracking protests, and then 2 in Lincolnshire, West and North Yorkshire, which is West Biscathorpe and West Newton. But yeah, it is a concern at the government level. You know, we have Boris Johnson leading, claiming that he is a climate leader, and we're so far from the truth on that. I mean, one of the other campaigns that I work on is Horse Hill, where that one slipped through the net, and Surrey County Council gave that oil company, UK Oil and Gas, a permit to drill for 20 years of oil production. And we're taking the council to court over that, for the downstream emissions, and that should be included in the environmental impact assessment. So the government have been spending taxpayers' money on fighting that in court. So there is still a lot of improvement to be made, but the tide is slowly turning and the conversation has changed.
Yeah, Lorraine, as I've mentioned to you, I'm originally from Canada, so I very much relate to national governments that claim to be all about urgent climate action and then use taxpayer dollars to buy a pipeline. I can relate. One of the main things that I'm hearing from this discussion so far is that it seems like, I mean, as Barbara said quite directly, at the local level, things are moving forward pretty excitingly. And then as you get up, it seems to be it's easy to get cynical. You know, at the national level, HISCA gave us an example of a win that happened really much quicker than expected. But that seems to be more of the exception than the rule. And I'm wondering how, in your experiences, we can link up the kind of grassroots, local community interest and commitment to climate action and push it up to higher levels so that even, you know, at the COP26 type level, people are actually listening to local campaigns. And any of you who have an idea on that, please feel free to unmute yourselves. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives.
Hi, I'll start with that. Obviously, you've got to push it up, like you say, from the grassroots. So the way we did it is we worked very much with NGOs and national organisations, as well as our own community groups at the lower level. So it's bringing the 2 ends together, if you will, people who could help us campaign nationally and hit the thing. I mean, the things that hurt them are legislation, as Lorraine's already said, things like planning and the law, things like that. The finance, and obviously public opinion. So they're the 3 things that you think you've got to start to hit. And we did a lot of campaigning with the government. We started off with our local councils initially. Local councils are MPs, because even the Conservative MPs started to think that fracking was unpalatable. And that's when the government started to change the point of view, when they realised that their own MPs were starting to get concerned about the impacts. So we drove it up from the bottom up that way to our MPs, and from there, and we also, and Lorraine will attest to this, we campaigned, we actually went and spoke in the Houses of Parliament, a couple of times, the House of Lords, you know, trying to affect the politicians and to get them to listen, because at the end of the day, if we don't get them to turn the legislation and to affect the finance, then we're not going to win. We've got, you know, and the other area, as we've already said, and where obviously HISCA have been really successful, is to hit the financial institutions like the banks and the insurance companies, the pension funds and the likes of those, and to campaign and to make it, that their investors don't want them to be supporting the fossil fuel industry. So it's very much, I always equate it, it's bottom up and top down, and we've all got to work together if we're going to beat it.
Yeah. And Dominica, I'd be curious to hear about the Fridays for Future perspective, because what I find interesting about Fridays for Future is that in some ways you're at the lowest possible grassroots level, where it's really quite dispersed. It's really among individuals in some ways. And in others, a lot of your campaigning is at the highest, most international level, like at the COP. So how do you make that connection? How do you see that connection?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think this is the magic of Fridays for Future and essentially of the youth climate movement, because that is true that we are based on this very grassroots levels, and we're in a lot of the times it is just about like a group of friends in cities or towns that are organizing and getting the work done and the protests. And I think the way I always view it is that Fridays for Future is more of like a spirit, I think, and also this kind of boldness that we are, realizing that the most power is located still on the national level and the governments. We realize that there needs to be a strong voice that will be calling to those in power and kind of undermine essentially the impact and the power that those people have. And I think I always find it just fascinating, the work that is done by NGOs on a local level, on those like community level. And I always, it's a hard work to be done, to shift things and not to be in that much of a spotlight, but still do the work and make very real, like touchable changes within the communities. But I also think that there is, this need for this different kind of community, like the Fridays for Future community, who will be able to kind of change the atmosphere in which we essentially talk about those things. And I think this is what Greta did, but this is what the whole movement did, is we essentially, by this very grassroots organizing on the streets, community building and organizing strikes, we changed just the narrative, which made things easier for those other initiatives, other NGO work to be done. Because we changed how we think and how we portray the climate the issue. And in that way, we are both able to obviously impact the national governments, but also make more space for the work that's being done on those other levels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that this idea of kind of shifting the conversation in order to make it unviable to do, to make negative climate decisions is relevant to everything that's been said so far. I have a question that is slightly shifting the topic, and that question, Hiska, I would like to start with you on this one, which is that we've already heard an example of these big organizations committing to doing something and then reneging on their commitments. And I'm wondering, from this perspective of Fossil Free Netherlands, you guys have done, as you said, 7 years of work to try to get these national pension funds to commit to divest. What's the next step to get these big organizations that have so much, power to actually follow through on these commitments and to do as they've promised?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that it shouldn't stay with this one pension fund, but we should make sure that all the dominoes are going to fall and that it's going to go forward. And this is, I think, the biggest task we are standing for. We really need to push all those institutions to go ahead. I do believe that ABP, the pension fund, they will live up to the promises they have made. Because they have been very clear about excluding all fossil fuel companies and not investing any longer in companies that keep on setting up new fossil fuel projects. This has been a main motivation for them. But the most important thing is that it really goes through to the banks. And for example, this pension fund is also invested in all kind of banks. So they need to take this stand against other banks and to use their shareholder power to influence them. And I'm not really sure whether they are going to do that, whether they are really going to push forward. And this is going to be a big, a big next campaign for us to make sure that the entire financial world, financial industry in the Netherlands, at least, will continue going through with what they have promised to do.
And what exactly does that entail in getting, such big, is it a matter of numbers and stats? Is that how you convince the banks?
Yeah, it's difficult. What they all say, and I think the other speakers have also spoken about it, they all say they are committed to the Paris Agreement. And they all come up with action plans. But what we see when you look at those action plans, many of those are still investing in companies that are still setting up new fossil fuel projects. So in a way, it's about exposing the greenwashing that is going on and the misleading. But I think also what we see, at least in the Netherlands, this IEA report about no new fossil fuel exploration, I think it has made impact. And what we need to do as a climate movement is to really draw a line by new fossil fuel exploration and new fossil fuel projects. And it is also that we can do internationally, and what is being done already at many places. And I think this is such a clear line that it should be possible, I'm optimistic about that, to convince the financial industry that this is the line they cannot cross. They cannot invest any longer in any company that is still setting up new fossil fuel projects. And of course, they are going to try to find ways to do it in any way, or like setting up projects that has CCS or the promise of CCS or whatever. But I do think there is much momentum in this new report and to go forward to all those institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I have just 2 more questions before I open up to the audience, but before I do move on, I was wondering if any of our other speakers would like to add anything on to what Hiske is saying already about kind of holding these companies accountable.
I just want to emphasize what Barbara has mentioned about the insurance companies. It's a really good idea to hit them, and the divestment movement is actually quite successful enough that they are bringing legislation here in England to try and stop divestment and boycotting. So that shows you just how successful it is, and it's about bleeding them dry. For us in the Southeast, they're small local oil companies, and your tactics, your strategy is to draw it out for so long that they just slowly run out of money, and then they don't actually have a seat at the table. But we need to continue and emphasizing what everyone else has said. It is about building up that pressure at a local level to influence our policymakers. It's slow, it really is slow, but we are seeing a change. But yeah, it's financially. You need to take the money from them, and you need to stop companies like insurance companies making it look, it's like the tobacco industry, isn't it? What we've done with the tobacco industry. It's like they need to stop insuring these companies. That is a way forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that it's so easy to get cynical and fatigued. If we're just going to have to keep on pushing, I think that this is work that can easily, I think activism in general, but especially climate activism, is work that can easily lead to burnout and to fatigue and to cynicism. And I think part of it is exactly what you're describing, because we just need to keep going and going and going until eventually all the dominoes fall. And I mean, I promise I will get to an actual question about burnout and fatigue, but I also think it's quite interesting that this work is work that's usually underpaid or unpaid, usually has a lot of burnout. And this is also the first event I've ever hosted where we have exclusively female presenting speakers and moderators. And I think that that's probably not a coincidence. But anyhow, I wanted to ask how you fight burnout and fatigue and cynicism in order to continue doing this work. I mean, yeah, it's not easy in my experience. Yeah, I see Dominica nodding.
Yes, I do because it is interesting to me because just recently I have been unfortunately battling with some people within the movement who disagree with visibility, or with the fact that I speak, and with my other friends we speak more about the justice aspects of the climate crisis, and we highlight the justice and how climate action needs to be rooted in ensuring social justice as well, which apparently is controversial, and it is to me always sad that I feel like especially within the movement, we very often forget, and we start kind of treating ourselves as the enemies rather than like the actual enemies on the outside world. And this has been a tremendous challenge, I think, because there have been so many tensions and just this we stop seeing each other as human beings, and we treat each other as those like abstract some political figures even, and we hold each other accountable, but in this very oppressive way. And so it has been this emotional work that needs to be done alongside fighting for justice in the outside world is, I think, it's essential, and it's equally valuable, but it is difficult. And the way I've been kind of trying to support myself and support each other in this work is that we have built with other female climate activists actually quite like an ecosystem of support. We have like group chats where we chat, we have regular meetings, and we and sometimes we just meet for just to speak about how we feel and how we want to proceed, how we want to work, how we what changes we dream of as of now, and we just kind of give each other hugs and support when we need it, and building those I think building this kind of collective of other activists, this collective of care, as I like to call it, has been first very practically very helpful in then meeting all of the other challenges within the movement and obviously on the outside. But it has also given me this opportunity to have a space where I can very freely talk about how I dream our work can look like, how I dream the Polish energetic sector could change, or the Polish politics could change. And I think this has been it lets me breathe, and also share the weight that comes with doing all of this work, so, obviously in such a difficult country as Poland is at the moment.
Yeah, it's activism fatigue and the burnout. It is intense because there just seems to be so few people really driving some of the climate work, and I know for myself one of the guidelines, one of the triggers that not the triggers, but one of the benchmarks I will give myself is when I start kind of screaming, why isn't more people doing something? And I can't expect them to do that. And that means that I myself is burning out. And it is about support. I've got a supportive partner, and it's good to chat through things. But for me, I've learned that I'm someone I'm quite driven, and I will have to stand back for a period of time. I can't actually look at things and say, oh, look, I'm just going to take a back seat on this one. I will drive it hard. And then, I'm actually just about to take a break now, because it is important. It's, as what was mentioned earlier on, even the conflict within our groups, because we may not agree on the same thing, that also brings about burnout. It brings about despair. We're all trying to fight for the same thing, and when we can't sit at the same table to do that, then it's sad, and it definitely causes fatigue.
Yes, I'm going to second that, or third it. I'm absolutely exhausted because we were campaigning from 2014 and I'm retired. Well, I was part-time working at the beginning, so I had more time than some people, but I was full-time fighting fracking for 5 years, and that included being down at the gates doing direct action. It involved being at the Houses of Parliament, you know, every element, fundraising, and you know, there's everything that you have to do. And I think that the answer is to bring other people on board, to use the skills that people have got and to use them effectively, to use the right people in the right place, to try not to do everything to reinvent the wheel. You know, if somebody else is already doing something, then don't reinvent the wheel, try and support them and work with them, maybe. I don't know what all the answers are. Social media has been one of the biggest boons, if you will, for communicating with people and getting the message across, particularly with COVID, and, you know, we've not been able to meet up in the same way. So I'm not sure what all the answers are, but I can just attest that I am absolutely drained at the moment. And we've done very little in the last 18 months. Our group have sort of not disbanded, but they've gone into hibernation because they were so exhausted. And I think the thing is to bring it back to people and make it real again, to understand that the threat is there, and to work with people like people within the EU, the NGOs, you know, people like that who can help maybe. So I don't know what the answers are, but I know how the others feel. I mean, you can see the bags under my eyes even now, you know, 18 months on, I'm still feeling, it's almost like a form of post-traumatic stress, even. I would go as far as to equate it to that. I'm shell-shocked. I'm just pleased that things are shifting in the right direction. So that gives me some hope, basically. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. And so I'm quite new in the activist world. I just joined like 1.5 years ago. And before that, I was just like literally like not looking at the climate crisis while feeling it all the time and feeling the despair. And now I still have the despair. I don't believe that our actions are doing enough to battling the climate crisis. It's not turning fast enough. But what I find is, as long as I'm working and I'm campaigning and I'm really like focusing on a small area of this crisis and where I can make a difference, then I can cope with it so much better. So climate activism does give me comfort as well, and it does help me in finding a way to deal with it. So it's a bit of a different story than the others, and perhaps it's also because I am. It has been a win and quite a fast campaign for me. So, but I do also find for many people that it really helps to be an activist, and I would believe that if more people would see that, more people can become involved, because it's not that scary. It even it's good to be along people who feel the same.
If I could,
I was just going to say, sorry, Dominica. I was just going to say that when we first started fighting, lots and lots of people said, "Oh, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to achieve anything. You know, Cordrilla are going to be able to frack, and whatever you do won't stop them." But it did stop them, you know, that and the earthquakes and various other things. And that is something to be proud of. And it's something, you know, people have to see that you can make a change, you can make a difference if you fight it. So not to sit back, but fight it. And I would never forgive myself, no matter how tired I am now, if I didn't, as Jessica said, fight in whatever way I could, because you've got to, there's too much at stake. Sorry, Dominica.
I actually might just quickly jump in before Dominica speaks. I will hand the floor back to you. In the meantime, while she's giving her address, we will shortly be opening up to questions from the audience. So if audience members want to ask questions, you can start either raising your hands or writing your questions in the chat. But yeah, in the meantime, Dominica, please respond as well.
No, I just wanted to kind of a bit what Hiske mentioned about, you know, the fact that the climate activism can it can bring so much joy and can be a source of, even in a way, like a way to save oneself too. And I very much feel that. And when I joined the movement, I think it was for me, it has been a remedy to the hopelessness, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was, besides, the government mishandling the health crisis, the climate crisis, there have been just so many abuses of human rights, of women's rights, and here in Poland. And so it really felt like, that the reality was just so, it in a way, it ties you in and takes hope away. And so activism became the way to kind of break out from this. And it has been a way to really, keep looking at the alternatives, keep looking at what could be done and how differently things could look like. And I feel like I always speak with, there are challenges, but I feel like doing activism, at least for me, it's in a way like a to really like live 100%. And I always say that it's like you experience the world differently when you center your work around the love that you have towards to the community, to the ecosystem. It really makes this, this appreciation towards the life that you live and the place you live in so much more practical and so much stronger. So I definitely just wanted to upbeat that, not to stay in this negative aspects of burnout and of work overload.
Yeah, I agree. It's just to quickly, it's my sanity. It's my sanity check, my activism. So yeah, it may burn me out, but yeah, I echo all of that.
What a wonderfully uplifting answer to my very negative question. This is a great direction that we took. So I have some other questions to ask, but since we're running a little bit lower on time, I wanted to also give the opportunity for audience members to ask questions. If you would like to ask a question, please either use the raise hand function or just write right in the chat, hand up, so that we know that you want to jump in and speak. I have kept the chat open so that I can see when those are coming through. And until then, I'm happy to keep pushing my own questions until we have some audience members who'd like to join. So right off the bat, I do see an interesting comment in the chat, but I don't see anyone yet who has a question. There is a comment here about how universal basic income could help to fight burnout and could support with activism, which I think is a very interesting point as well. It also ties in to the points that Dominica was making about keeping justice at the center of this, acknowledging that, one of the difficulties of climate activism is that if it is unpaid, then there's just real limits to how much people are able to contribute in order to still make ends meet. Would any of you have any sort of comments or reflections on that point from the chat before I move on to the next question? No? All right. Well, then my next question is actually pivoting a little bit, which is that, Dominica mentioned that it's a difficult situation in Poland right now. Lorraine and Barbara have mentioned various different national moratoriums and regulations. And I'm curious about the comparison between the 3 European countries we have on the call here. I mean, activism, well, let's say the Netherlands, the UK, and Poland are in vastly different situations in some ways with respect to climate activism, your relationship to the EU, your relationship on the world stage, and in other ways are very similar. You're all European countries with a lot of things in common. And I'm wondering if you've heard anything either in this conversation or in your collaborative work more broadly about how activism differs in these various different contexts and how the national context kind of plays into the type of campaigning and movements and wins that you're able to achieve and to push forward.
I think for the fact that we have disastrously left the EU, for us, they're going to rip apart a lot of our environmental regulations, and I think it will change a lot. I mean, even though we have a fracking moratorium, it still could be possible that comes back because of the government in place. So it's difficult to really judge what's going to take place in England with us exiting the EU. yeah, it's quite frightening, to be quite honest. You know, all the safeguards that are in place, you know, that we've lost them. I mean, our government are even trying to change the Human Rights Act. So yeah, it's quite scary over here. And with our police crime and sentencing bill, it's also bringing about restrictions on people going out to protest, and severe restrictions, almost making it so that they could stop some people attending protests. So yeah, it's even though the tide is turning, the conversation is changing around the climate, our government are really trying hard to stop us getting out on the streets and campaigning and to stop and lobby the government. So I'd be interested to hear what's happening in the other countries.
Well, I think speaking from the Polish perspective, especially recently during the past 2 years, doing any sort of activism here is honestly like it's a wild circumstances that we have to do with. During the pandemic, the government has decided to ban all sorts of protests, spontaneous protests especially, and they claim that it is in order to protect our health. But while the churches were all open during the whole of the pandemic, during lockdown, and people were able to gather there, and we weren't able to gather on the streets, that really put, this intention of the so-called intention of the government into question. Especially last year when the women's strikes erupted, and there has been, a really massive social uprising. When we would campaign for our climate and we would host, for instance, climate strikes, people were being arrested by the police. We were interrogated. Kids like 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, where police would come to their houses, check their flats, harass them. And so it really is just a different battleground, I think. Right now the situation isn't as drastic, I think, as it was in 2020, but still the biggest, I think, difficulty right now is that the Polish government is far from a democratic government, and they use all sorts of ways to block itself from the society in any way possible. And this has had such a tremendous impact on the civil society, on the NGOs, on the movements, because reaching to any sort of administration members is barely possible. Having conversations with them is barely possible. And we are just, you are forced to use such different ways of power building when those in power have so much capacities and have so much power, essentially, and they do not respond to the democratic ways of campaigning. So we just have to be more creative, more resilient. But I think I always say that this, if things will change in Poland, if we will shift from our 70% dependency on coal, and we will, go to and build a cleaner, healthier, and safer society, it is possible anywhere.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I hear from your intervention is that while that might not be the case in the UK or the Netherlands, which we have represented in this call, that kind of antagonism against protest is certainly reality in many countries of the world. So there is still room, I think, regardless of your circumstance, to find co-conspirators with which you can be creative and finding solutions. So we have two audience questions. One came from the chat a little while ago, so I will read that one out first. And then we also had a participant raise their hand. I think that we only have time to take those two questions and then do a final round. But if anyone else has questions that you would like to ask, Nicholas will put our info@SONNET Energy email in the chat, so you can always be in touch with us as well. So the first question that came through was actually from a researcher who we work with in SONNET, who said that as a researcher working in academia, she always wonders in what ways academia can make a difference for campaigns and for the activism that you're doing, and in what ways can academic research on this type of activism on energy transition, how can it bolster or support your work? I see both Hiska and Lorraine have your hands up. So Hiska, perhaps we can start with you, and then Lorraine will move to you as well.
Yeah, in our campaign, academics and universities have been instrumental, and schools and all kinds of schools have been instrumental in our campaign, and in particular because we need people to speak up. Climate change can't be about activists that are kind of like labeled as an extreme group or like completely on the left. We need the mainstream to speak up and to show that the arguments that we are bringing forward are not extreme, and they are right, and they are based on the science. And when people in academia are not speaking up, this silence really hurts climate activism. So we need them. We need them to speak up. And in our campaign, it has been really instrumental in getting ABP eventually to divest. Because we had a very good and strong campaign of the Scientists of Future that really put pressure on all universities and asking the board of universities to speak up against the pension fund. But all these universities, they also have bank accounts and they are banking at financial institutions that are still investing in fossil fuels. So we should make sure that they start speaking up against their banks, for example. But we need them a lot.
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
I just briefly echo that. You know, it's academia is producing our peer-reviewed facts, studies that drives our objections and our wins. So yeah, it's vital, really.
I think it also gives credibility. Like, I think that's what Hiska was saying, that it's not just the campaigners and the activists and the NGOs, that it's the science behind it, and it's absolutely essential that we have that. Absolutely essential.
I know we're running low on time, and we do still have one more question from the audience, but I do have a quick follow-up. If perhaps you could just try to answer as briefly as possible. Do you feel like the bridges between activists and academics are smooth enough? Like, are you able to access all the research that's coming out in clear ways, or is there something else that you need in order to better make use of this research?
I think it can be much better, and also in terms of access to research. I'm always having difficulties in getting access to new research and to find ways, because we don't have this. And also, I think people from academics can also actively approach us with new studies that we could help. So often we are approaching people in academia, but it can also be the other way around.
Yes, we had quite a few researchers came, obviously because of the fracking in Lancashire. So we took part. In fact, I think I've probably taken part in research for about 50 or more research projects with universities, mainly in the UK, but also in Europe as well. A lot of them were focused around the activism and things like that, and so the social elements. I think we need more on the geology and the seismology and the actual impacts of carbon, the methane emissions, etc., and what the actual impacts really are. That's where I think we need more information, more link up, or more information for campaigners.
Yeah, I'm just cognizant of the time. I would like to give Patrick had his hand up. Before you ask your question, Patrick, just a reminder that this is being recorded and is being streamed to YouTube. So if you are comfortable having your voice and your picture on YouTube, then please feel free to turn on your camera now to ask your question. Otherwise, you can write it in the chat so I can read it out. But yes, we only have about 5 minutes left, and I would also have a final round of reflection on looking to the future. So Patrick, could you give us a bit of a heads up about whether you'd like to ask your question over chat or turn on your camera?
Sure, Adrian, maybe I'll just leave it with voice only, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Fantastic. So I really like where the discussion went when we started talking about other stakeholders, in this case, academia. I know when it comes to stakeholder capitalism, businesses are really looking to the conversations you're having now, and the activism is really supporting big momentum from corporate behavior. Expanding your discussion now to beyond just academia pairings, so the kind of movement working closer with academia, how do you see branching further to also partner with other stakeholders, including companies? Or is that kind of a realm of stakeholder bridges that you're less interested in?
It's just reminded me of a company, an oil and gas company in in Yorkshire called Third Energy, that has now working with the campaigners that were fighting that company because they've moved into green renewable energy. And that was just incredible to see the people who were challenging that company suddenly directors of that company because they have changed so radically. So yeah, I mean, I love that story. It's great. So yeah, let's work from within and change.
I was going to say exactly the same as Lorraine. Let's work with the renewable energy companies, the green energy, work with them, and because hopefully they've got the resources and the finances to help as well. And obviously they've got a vested interest. If we can shift the change to renewable energy and we can encourage investment in renewable energy, then yeah, I think that's a really exciting idea.
Yeah, and I think that this question also ties into the discussion we had at the very beginning about the role of insurance companies and the role of working with insurance companies to make sure they're not insuring, climate disastrous projects, essentially. Do any of you want to add anything to that, or has it already been covered, this point about insurance and banks as well?
Is that a question for me?
Sure, yeah.
Well, so can you repeat that? Sorry,
just linking the question about working with the private sector also to our earlier discussion about insurance companies and the role that can be played bridging between activists and insurers.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I suppose it's just like it's difficult because the larger the insurance companies that insure fossil fuel projects are not generally your small-time insurance companies that you could even like boycott. So that would need like a dedicated campaign. We included it in one of our previous campaigns of just like, because of the pandemic, most of it's been online, and was literally just targeting insurers with the climate wrecking projects that they were insuring, just to highlight and bring awareness to that. And I think it's just bombarding the public about what these companies are doing and who they are insuring. Without insurance, these projects are unable to go ahead. If you remove that aspect of them, as I said, it's all part of the finance aspect. If you remove that, they are unable to go ahead. But yeah, it's not a project, it's not a campaign that I have personally worked on, just kind of help with some social media.
Yeah,
that's what I was just saying about the Some of Us, that as an organisation, they've just put this thing out on social media where you can actually write to your MP, so to put pressure on Lloyds via the government. And, I'm going to share it, I'm going to do it, so I think that's the thing to do, to share that, encourage people to take part in those sort of petitions and protests. And yeah, you become weary of doing the petitions and protests, but it does make a difference. So it's encouraging people to do so.
Yeah. All right, we only have 2 minutes left, so I have a closing question. I'll ask you each just to take 30 seconds to perhaps answer in just a couple words. But the year's coming to an end and we're looking forward. We started this conversation by reflecting on progress in 2021, and I'd like to look forward to 2022. So I'd like to ask that each of you share one wish, so one kind of external thing that you hope happens in 2022, and one resolution, one thing that you want to commit to in 2022 in order to advance energy transition. So yeah, Hiska, would you like to start us off with one wish and one resolution for the next year?
Yeah, my wish would be that we stop all new fossil fuel projects. Let's be ambitious. Yeah, my resolution is to not give up. What I've really seen is even if you think it's not going forward, it might already be in the air somewhere. And if you, I think we often walk out too fast. So remain focused, even if you think that, it's not going forward. So that's my resolution.
Great. And I'm just going to go in the order on my screen. So Barbara, you're up next.
actually written mine. I never knew you were going to ask this sort of question. My wish is that all forms of fossil fuel extraction will be banned by law under some sort of climate change legislation, and that all funding and investment will be directed towards the renewable and sustainable energy sector. In other words, let's punish the polluters. And my commitment is basically just to continue to fight in whatever way I can, be it advising others, lobbying politicians, and just making sure that my local community is aware of the danger and that try to get them involved.
Yeah, very well said. Dominika, you're up next on my screen.
Well, my hope is that the civil society in Poland will realize the power that we have in mobilizing people and in building and working together and really shifting away from this very crisis reality that we are stuck in now, and that seems like there isn't any other alternative. So I hope that we will finally be able to kind of believe that we are able to change things effectively. And my resolution is that I want to, together with my fellow climate activists, my friends, to really be loud and put a very strong end to the coal era here in Poland, because the industry is nearly dead right now. And but the just transition isn't happening. So we really want to campaign strongly, put a very strong end to that, and really push forward with the just transition towards clean energy.
Excellent. And last but not least, Lorraine.
My wish is that we win our court case. We are waiting for a judgment, hopefully before Christmas, and that will entail that all oil and gas applications will need to take into account scope 3 and downstream emissions, which would mean that the environment impact assessment would be huge. So yeah, that's, you know, keeping it on a local level. And my resolution, slightly different from everyone else's, is that going back to activism fatigue, I'm just going to be a little bit kind to myself. And at the beginning of the year, I'm just going to take a little bit of a break, give myself a few hugs.
I think that's excellent. Also, there's so much to discuss that we didn't even get to go into using the courts to advance climate activism, which I think is a fascinating other topic that we could get to as well. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I really want to extend sincere thanks to our speakers, to our participants. Thank you all very much. If you're interested in learning more, this discussion was kind of prompted by some case studies that SONNET researchers did about movements against fossil fuel energy pathways. And in the new year, we will also be publishing some comparative cases. So looking at specifically comparing different countries and how these movements have evolved in different places and contexts. So Nicholas has put our website in the chat. I would strongly encourage you to check that out. And thank you all very much.